Sup, chooms? Good to be back with y'all. So, my last video on whether the European Union would ban finasteride created quite a reaction. Almost all the comments were from people being understandably very upset, and my video even managed to somehow get a suicide warning notification. It was definitely sobering news, and it didn't give me any pleasure having to disappoint my fellow hair loss switchers, but I have to admit, I am glad my last video got this reaction. That's because people should be upset, and they should be upset that the EU is even considering something so preposterous as actually outright banning finasteride and dutasteride, two drugs that are prescribed to millions of men to treat hair loss and an enlarged prostate, and whom the vast majority will only have a good experience using. People should be pissed off at this because it's bullshit. But the reaction to the video was so strong that I think some of my viewers are currently in a veritable state of panic, and that definitely wasn't my intention at all, chooms. So I decided I'd create a quick follow-up video in order to further address this controversy. So, first of all, nobody at this point knows for sure what the final decision on 5-AR inhibitors will be in the EU, and we won't know until after they finish their review in the next few months. One thing I found pretty funny though in the response to my video is that some people in the comment section, they went so far as to say that maybe this action justifies Brexit because now the UK doesn't have to follow the EU rules anymore. So whatever the EU does, finasteride will still be available in the United Kingdom. Now, I don't really want to get into the politics of Brexit. I mean, after all, it is an election year here in the United States, so all of this political drama is mentally draining enough as it is. But as it turns out, the UK actually did a thorough review of the safety of finasteride just this year, similar to what the EU is doing, and they fortunately decided not to ban the drug. In other words, the UK National Health Service reached the same conclusion this year that the FDA in the United States did in 2022. Specifically, they said that although there are reports of persistent sexual dysfunction, depression, and suicidal ideation in people using the drug, the evidence does not show that there is a causal link between the use of finasteride and any of these side effects. In other words, they think that PFS is complete bullshit like the majority of doctors do. All these reviews of finasteride in the United States have been initiated by the Post-Finasteride Syndrome Foundation, or network as it's now called, who have been trying for years now to get finasteride pulled off the market. If we look at the UK report on finasteride, we see that it's also the PFS network that petitioned the UK National Health Service to review finasteride. In fact, not only did the PFS network give a short presentation on post-finasteride syndrome to the UK committee investigating finasteride, they actually asked that post-finasteride syndrome be classified as a recognized medical diagnosis, which the UK committee refused to do, saying basically that's not our job and that the bloody PFS network can rightfully bugger off. So this is just more evidence that the PFS network is so desperate that they will do anything they can to get post-finasteride syndrome into the medical textbooks as a real condition, and they're not going to let something as trivial as scientific evidence get in their way. These organizations are run by spiteful and litigious people who are hoping they can get rich by suing Merck and other distributors of 5-AR medications like telehealth companies. In civil court, oftentimes juries and judges can be just as scientifically illiterate as your average rosemary oil pushing TikTok zoomer, so making a scientific argument to win a civil case and becoming a millionaire really isn't all that difficult. And if you can make the case that post-finasteride syndrome has official recognition by a major governmental health agency like those in the USA, the UK, or the EU, those kind of theatrics could be just what the PFS network needs to hit the jackpot. So all these anti-finasteride organizations are universally scamful. They're not actually interested in curing people, because if people could be cured of this condition, whether it's real or imaginary, that would destroy their narrative, since their mantra is that post-finasteride syndrome is permanent. So if you guys want to be mad at someone or something, then you should be mad at these anti-finasteride organizations who want to deprive you of the one thing that is preventing you from becoming yet another bald and bearded clone. And it is all just because these fascist bald cell conspiracy theorists want everyone else to suffer just so they can better cope with their decision not to take finasteride. Misery loves company. Anyways, let's go ahead and take a look at how the UK dealt with the same issue that the EU is now facing, specifically whether or not to ban finasteride. Here's the document that contains the complete review of finasteride by the UK, published in April of 2024. I'll just hit the high points here, but I'll go ahead and link the whole document below in case you want to read it. So, what the UK did was basically the same thing the EU is starting to do now. They did a complete review of all the medical literature that has been published on finasteride being associated with depression, suicide, sexual dysfunction, as well as the biased and flawed medical literature that exists on post-finasteride syndrome for what little that's worth. The results of this literature review by the UK showed that the studies looking at psychiatric and sexual adverse effects of finasteride showed inconsistent results. One of the major inconsistencies is that the lower dose of finasteride used for hair loss, which is 1 milligram per day, it seemed to have a higher risk of side effects than the dose used for benign prostatic hyperplasia, which is 5 milligrams per day. I mean, if you think about it, that really makes no sense at all. If a drug causes side effects at a low dose, then you would expect it to cause even more side effects at a high dose. However, people taking the 1 milligram dose are usually younger men taking finasteride for hair loss. As the UK review points out, quote, "It is well known that the subjects who use finasteride at 1 milligram per day for hair loss differ from patients who use finasteride at 5 milligrams for benign prostatic hyperplasia. The former usually are young men using finasteride for hair loss. For some of these men, hair loss may be the cause or lead to depressive symptoms," unquote. Thank you! This is what I've been saying for a long time now on this channel. Hair loss itself, of course, causes depression. So just because someone with hair loss gets depression while taking finasteride, that doesn't mean that the depression was actually caused by finasteride. In addition, another thing I've said over and over again on this channel is that depression and sexual dysfunction are highly multifactorial conditions, and they both occur very commonly in the general population. I think the people who wrote this report for the UK must be viewers of my channel because they say, quote, "The adverse effects of depression and sexual dysfunction are multifactorial, and it is important to note that there is a prevalence of these in the general population. So when looking at studies with no control group, this makes assessing the results difficult," unquote. The report quotes some studies showing that erectile dysfunction is very common, even in young men. For example, they mention a study that found that 26% of men under the age of 40 suffer from erectile dysfunction. The report emphasizes that this high prevalence needs to be kept in mind when assessing causality. In other words, unless you design a study with a control group, you can't assume that any supposed side effects, whether it be depression or sexual problems, are actually due to finasteride use, because these problems frequently occur in people who don't take finasteride, particularly in hair loss sufferers. The report also stresses that people who have a previous history of mental health problems or who have relatives with mental health problems, they are more likely to develop side effects from finasteride. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that finasteride caused psychiatric side effects directly in those people. It just means that people with a psychiatric history or who have the genetics for psychiatric illnesses are much more likely to have psychiatric problems in general, and that's regardless of whether or not they use finasteride. Then, the report exhaustively reviewed all the literature on persistent side effects, the so-called post-finasteride syndrome. The reviewers felt that the studies on PFS were small and often biased because the subjects were drawn from patient groups who were convinced that finasteride did them harm, like the Propecia Health Forum, for example. The article points out that, quote, "This increases the likelihood of selection bias as patients who believe they are experiencing a drug-related adverse event are more likely to volunteer for research," unquote. The report doesn't mention this, but these studies are also biased because many of them are funded by the PFS network. The report also stresses that a lot of the post-marketing data is based on databases that are spontaneous reporting of side effects by patients themselves, such as the FAERS FAERS database. They correctly point out that these databases aren't reliable due to the effects of biased reporting stimulated by online fear-mongering, as well as uncertainty about causality, meaning whether or not the symptoms were actually even related to finasteride at all. In addition, when they did a survey on members of the PFS network, they reported that, quote, "A large variety of symptoms, including several physical symptoms which are not included in the product information as known side effects. For example, muscle cramps, twitching, thin skin, fatigue, and muscle weakness," unquote. That's really interesting to me. It makes me wonder why they left out numbness in the anal region, or the cases where finasteride caused people to become transgendered and transition from male to female. Why didn't they think that those were worth mentioning, I wonder? So, as far as persistent side effects go, the report concluded that the research was inconclusive. That's of course why the vast majority of doctors don't accept that PFS is a real thing, other than a few fringe doctors on the PFS network's payroll like Dr. Trash and Dr. Earwig. Getting back to depression and suicide, the UK ended up in this review clarifying in the finasteride package insert and patient information that cases of suicide have been reported in post-marketing data. There's no doubt that people are making those claims even if they are unsubstantiated, so the UK, just like the FDA, felt obligated to report this information to the public. However, it's very clear from the full report that the UK was skeptical of the data supporting depression and suicide, as well as the data supporting persistent side effects happening after stopping finasteride. So, just like with the FDA in the United States, in the UK, the drug packaging information has been updated. But clearly, this was just done for legal reasons to avoid litigation and not for any legitimate medical reasons. So neither the UK nor the USA banned finasteride, and I doubt the EU will either. It's an extremely useful drug that treats not only hair loss, but also an enlarged prostate. There are other drugs out there that treat an enlarged prostate besides 5-AR blockers, like we have alpha blockers, for instance, but those drugs have significantly more side effects and they aren't tolerated well by everybody. For hair loss, though, there really is virtually no alternative for treating androgenetic alopecia other than finasteride and dutasteride. I mean, topical anti-androgens don't even come close. It would be a disaster for European hair loss switchers if the EU decide to ban finasteride and dutasteride, but I don't think it is going to happen. No chance. I think the EU, just like the UK and USA, will come to the same conclusion. They will update the labeling of the drug like the UK and USA did, and they'll continue to provide the drug. And then they'll tell the PFS network they're a bunch of morons for wasting their time. That, of course, won't make the PFS network very happy, but then again, nothing ever does. So, this has got to really hurt for all the anti-finasteride trolls out there because they get so angry at me for my stance on post-finasteride syndrome, but here are these huge governmental health organizations run by some of the most qualified medical health professionals in the entire world, and they're making the same arguments and drawing the same conclusions that I myself made on this very channel years ago. So the only conclusion the PFS network is going to see in their futile attempt to ban finasteride will be the inconvenient truth that I was right this whole time and they were wrong. So hair loss switchers watching this video, you don't need to worry. This drug isn't going anywhere. It's not going to get banned, not even close. The PFS network is going to lose, and we are going to have a great time next year gloating about their defeat as they continue to wallow in their misery. Thank you for watching, hair loss switchers. God bless.